Well, good morning, everyone. Can I call everyone to order this morning? Good morning, good morning. Glad to see everyone is up so bright and early here on this beautiful day here in Des Moines, Iowa. Well, again, good morning. My name is Mark Keenum. I'm serving as chairman of BIFAD. I also serve in my day job as president of Mississippi State University. And I want to say again, welcome to this meeting, this 180th public meeting of the Board for International Food and Agricultural Development. And the topic this morning that we're going to be talking about at this convening event is an issue that we discussed back some months ago with Administrator Mark Green. Is an issue that he had a great interest in for USAID. And the topic is agriculture and food security in conflict-affected and fragile context. And I think you all recognize this is a very timely issue for us in this world that we live in. But a little bit about BIFAD itself, just for those of you who may not be that familiar with this organization. The Board for International Food and Agricultural Development traces its beginnings back to 1975. It was part of Title XII of the Food Security Assistance Act. And one of our sponsors of this organization, who had the vision of creating an advisory board to help provide advice and counsel to the administrator for USAID, was a gentleman by the name of, Congressman Paul Finley. And unfortunately, we lost Congressman Finley back this August, but it was his vision and that of his colleagues more than 40 years ago who had the vision, again, to create this board to provide leadership and advice to the administration, in particular the administrator for USAID. And we greatly appreciate his vision and those of others that have worked with him. Well, the members of the BIFAD board are appointed by the President of the United States. And these are individuals who give of themselves, they're volunteers, but they're passionate about addressing issues of global hunger. And with that, we have several of our board members who are here with us this morning, and I would like to invite my colleagues on the board to stand and introduce themselves to the audience. Mr. Ash.
Good morning and welcome. I'm Jim Ash. I'm a corporate attorney from Kansas City, Missouri, who practices in the food and agricultural industry. Grew up in a farming community in Southern California and then found myself in a huge farming community in Kansas City and its environs. So thanks for being with us today.
Good morning. I'm Pamela Anderson. I worked overseas for 40 years on food-related issues with smallholder farmers. I'm an entomologist, epidemiologist, and my last position was as the Director Emerita of the International Potato Center.
I'm Brady Deaton, former Chancellor of the University of Missouri and agricultural economist, and I've conducted a lot of research work on international issues and been active in the university issues regarding those developmental issues that concern all of us. Thanks to all of you for being here this morning.
Thank you. Well, as I mentioned this morning, we'll be having opportunities to examine issues around agriculture, food security, in fragile and conflict-affected context, including issues around displacement and its effects on food systems. We'll have time for discussions and questions, and after all of the presentations, and starting at around noon today, we'll be taking public comments and questions. Participants can submit their questions anytime over the internet, and I know we welcome those who are watching this over the internet, but submit your questions to dferguson@aplu.org. And I would ask, please try to keep your comments as brief as possible so that we can accommodate as many people as we can. And I would also say that minutes of the meeting will be available on the BIFAD website no later than 90 days after this meeting concludes. So with that, We've got three speakers that are going to somewhat set the context and stage for our discussions this morning. We'll be hearing from three speakers, and I would like to introduce our first speaker. His name is Matt Nims. He is the Deputy Director for Food for Peace at USAID. Matt has over 17 years of international development and emergency programming experience. He's been with USAID since 2000, most recently serving as Deputy Director for the Office of Food for Peace. Mr. Nims was a water and sanitation technician in the Dominican Republic with the Peace Corps and has a master's degree in international public health from Emory University. Mr. Matt Nims.
Good morning, everybody. As Chairman Keenum said, I am Matthew Nims. Thank you to BIFAD and to the Chairman for that introduction and for holding this. This is a pretty important topic, I think. And as the Chairman said, we're going to give a little background. Myself, Greg Collins, Mr. Tom Duffy from State Department will give a background on this topic, on conflict and food security. So I do believe that this focus on food security systems, conflict and fragile states is very timely. And I think throughout the rest of today and even through the next 2 or 3 days, you're going to be hearing a lot of numbers and a lot of things about what we're seeing right now in the world. But I do think that these statistics are worth repeating and keeping in our minds. So I'm going to go through a couple of them. Right now, 113 million people are experiencing acute food insecurity and are in desperate need of emergency assistance. So that's happening, right now. Just to put that in perspective here from people from the United States, that's more than the population of California, Texas, and Florida combined. Another 700 million are chronically hungry, lacking food, and enough food to lead active, healthy lives. So that's 820 million people, 1 out of every 9 in the world, who are hungry right now. Unfortunately, hunger is on the rise for the first time in decades, primarily due to conflict, often compounded by natural disasters like drought or other events. Violence prevents farmers from planting and harvesting crops, robbing them of their livelihoods, and later robbing others of the food that they should have been growing to eat. Conflict prevents people from traveling to and from markets, and often driving up the prices of that food if they're able to access the market at all. People cope by selling their possessions, eating less, or make other dangerous coping strategies just to survive for them and their families. Over time, conflict prevents people from living full, healthy lives because they are weakened from the lack of food and fall victim to preventable illness. USAID's Office of Food for Peace is the world's largest provider of international food assistance. Last year, our office reached 76 million people in almost 60 countries with life-saving food assistance. But more than half of the emergency resources were spent responding to just 5 crises. That's because other places like Syria, South Sudan, Venezuela, Yemen are bigger, affecting more people, lasting much longer, and incredibly more complex than those types of crises that we've had in the past. Today, addressing food insecurity means operating amidst conflict and fragility. Since the majority of Food for Peace work takes place in these contexts, I thought I'd share a couple of unique challenges that we have found when we try to, or where our partners try to address food security in these types of environments. So number one, I think what we're finding, let's say in the last 2 or 3 years, access is our biggest challenge. When I say our, I mean us as well as our operating partners. Without access, we can't assess the needs. We can't do the adequate monitoring that these programs need. In 2016, this community, the food assistance community, the emergency response community, believed that there was a famine taking place in Borno in northeast Nigeria. But our partners and other humanitarian actors had limited to 0 access. We couldn't gather the information we needed to actually demonstrate that an actual famine was taking place. Boko Haram, ISIS, other actors were preventing our access into those areas. Even when we know that the people needed our help, without the ability to move freely in these environments, without being able to get to the people in need, we're then, around these conflict environments, the humanitarian actors can't reach these people to provide that life-saving assistance. Again, all towards access. Right now in Yemen, more than 20 million people need food assistance, including 5 million people who are close to famine. Recent clashes in Aden, just recently, meant that the humanitarian programs operating there actually had to stop, pause, or scale down at the very least. Again, denying millions, literally, of people the assistance that they need, the life-saving food assistance or other assistance that they need. Working in conflict zones also means that the humanitarian partners, the people on the ground, often local people from that area, are putting themselves at risk. Faced with ambushes, suicide attacks, improvised explosive devices, aid workers bravely put themselves into danger to help others. Last year, at least 405 aid workers were killed, injured, or kidnapped. This trend has been increasing the last 3 years. The second issue I think that we've been finding is, and it seems a bit obvious, but it bears mentioning, is that it's harder to reach people who are on the move. The most vulnerable are those that are displaced. More than 70 million people right now are displaced in the world, including 26 million refugees, mostly, almost all of these are as a result of conflict. This is the highest number in history thus far that we have recorded. Though refugee camps are like, I think, the most visible symbol of this tragedy, that's actually not where the majority of these people are. They are not housed in camps. They are actually throughout the societies that they go to, either the regions within their own country or cross-border. This makes it very hard to reach them, because we don't exactly know where they all are. They could be very displaced and diffused through a given region or population center. Additionally, when you're displaced, you lose access of your livelihoods, which means it's more difficult to purchase food on the food side. In addition, you have reduced access to healthcare. You have reduced access to health systems. You're more vulnerable in a protection-like scenario. The displaced are the most vulnerable in this, and hence are more prone to present with greater needs and need greater assistance. This makes it more difficult for us to actually find them and to access them. Traditional food distributions or even assistance type programs don't work when we have large numbers of people on the move. Right now in Venezuela, 5 million Venezuelans are in the neighboring countries of Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Or in Syria, where you've got over 3 million people in places like Jordan and Lebanon, very diffused in large urban centers. Traditional distribution methods are not going to work there. We have to challenge ourselves to develop better ways to reach those people, to be able to identify their needs. And finally, I think the root cause of what's happening in the world cannot be solved by the humanitarian community. And I think this is something that's been said a little bit over time, but I think we're seeing it really come into focus, let's say, the last year or so. We, the humanitarian actors, the humanitarian assistance community, we are the ultimate Band-Aid, but we are not the cure. We are not going to fix this by trying to staunch the bleeding. The United States is very, very committed to helping people who need our help. Ultimately, political solutions and lasting peace are needed in order to make self-reliance a reality. Unfortunately, political solutions do not happen in a timely or quick manner. And the needs will continue, and the needs that we have seen have continued to grow every year. Conflict in Yemen has lasted over 4 years. USAID has spent $1.5 billion on food and nutrition programs alone. 5 years in fighting in South Sudan, and $2.4 billion expended in the humanitarian sphere from the United States. 7 years in Syria, over $3 billion. Again, this is just to hold back the bleeding, for lack of a better word. This is not addressing the cause. This is not fixing the problem. Tremendous amounts of money being expended in these type of endeavors. Protracted emergencies mean that we need to build resilience into humanitarian response, and we need to get development actors, traditional food security and agricultural folks, to focus and work in more fragile states, in more fragile conditions and situations. This is actually the focus of a conversation that I'll be leading in this room tomorrow morning with representatives from Catholic Relief Services, World Vision, and UN World Food Program. Ultimately, success always means a well-coordinated field effort. The USAID Administrator Mark Green has said, tackling hunger requires an all-hands-on-deck approach, which is why I'm looking forward to Greg Collins. Greg Collins' focus on how USAID's forthcoming transformation will help our agency be more efficient and effective, and why Tom Duffy from State Department will focus on essential links among development, diplomacy, and defense efforts. And why I look forward to hearing the BIFAD members' insights over the next few hours as we sit here to discuss this very important issue affecting food security. We in the humanitarian community, not alone, face many tough challenges right now. And I think working together with the humanitarian, the development, the political, and other actors, we can raise to the challenge. Quite frankly, we really don't have a choice. And I think anybody involved in food security on a global scale, this has really become our responsibility to look at these problems in a different way, to work better together to solve them. The Band-Aid approach is not working. The siloed development approach is not working. It's forums like this where we can talk about it and figure out how to go forward is what's needed. So thank you very much for the time and for my opportunity to speak to you today. Okay.
Mr. Nims, thank you so much for that, for those remarks, but more importantly, for what you do. Thank you. Our next speaker, who's going to help set the stage for our topic this morning, is Greg Collins. He is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Food Security at USAID. Mr. Collins is, again, the Deputy Assistant Administrator. He oversees strategic direction and implementation of Feed the Future programs in the field, the innovative agriculture research and policy efforts, and the USAID Center for Resilience, and serves as the agency's resilience coordinator. Mr. Greg Collins.
So first of all, let me just echo Matt's opening thank you to Chairman Keenum and the BIFAD for holding this event. It is extremely timely, and Matt sort of set the stage with some of the most obvious areas where we're seeing this challenge of protracted conflict resulting in not only recurrent humanitarian spending, but humanitarian spending, outrageous amounts of humanitarian spending year on year for a long amount of time. But it's not just the Syrias, the Venezuelas, it's Eastern DRC, it's Somalia, it's Karamoja in Uganda, it's Niger, it's Burkina Faso, it's Mali, and the list goes on and on and on. And what this all results in, as Matt suggested, is unprecedented humanitarian need. Each year, each is unprecedented in comparison to the prior. And it's simply unsustainable from a U.S. government perspective, unsustainable from a global perspective. And I think we need to be very honest about what the causes of this are. It is conflict, but it's also climate. And it's the intersection of these things coming together, often in very complex ways, and all of the follow-on effects, health shocks and stresses. Yes, droughts and floods, but longer-term governance issues and fragility. So it's not as simple as a drought, a flood, a conflict. We're actually dealing with highly complex risk environments that make this all the more challenging. And I think what we've seen is, in addition to unprecedented humanitarian need, and even that's deeply concerning, but even more broadly than that, we've made tremendous progress on reducing poverty over the last few decades, but we're also seeing people backsliding into poverty at alarming rates, very alarming rates, that suggest that we'll never get to ending poverty if we don't address the underlying challenges, the shocks and stresses that are causing people to backslide. And as Matt noted, and I think is really striking, hunger has reversed course for the first time in 15 years. And if that doesn't wake us up that the world's changing around us and that we didn't need to adapt to it, I don't know what will. I've helped lead at USAID an effort looking at building resilience to recurrent crisis. That effort was born out of drought emergencies in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. Even in those instances, conflict was always a factor, whether it's herder-farmer conflict, et cetera. But more and more, conflict isn't just an exacerbating factor, it's actually becoming a driver. The work we began in Niger and Burkina Faso in 2012, 2013 was primarily predicated on dealing with climate events, exacerbated on the margins by conflict. But if you look at those places, Tillabéri in Niger, northern Burkina Faso, even Mopti in Mali, look at the nature of the challenge there and the role that conflict's playing. So these are incredibly challenging problem sets. We as an agency have revitalized our agency's Resilience Leadership Council. The heads of not only the Bureau for Food Security and the head of Matt's Bureau, but the Africa Bureau, the Global Health Bureau, the Education Environment Bureau. So we've got a holistic group of people looking at this problem set. That body, the Resilience Leadership Council, recently expanded the number of resilience-focused countries from 7 to 13. And if we look at the new countries that are added to that list, we're looking at countries like Nigeria, and we've got Soji here who will talk to northeastern Nigeria. And so while we may not be able to take the tools of development to the heart of the conflict in Borno State, we can absolutely take the tools of development, foremost amongst them ag-led growth, to dealing with the trying to rebuild in the surrounding states of the Northeast. And when the opportunity strikes to move into Borno State to begin to build back. The problem is if we don't do that, Matt and his colleagues are going to be in Borno State for the next 20 years providing food assistance to people who should be seen as a development priority, not just a humanitarian priority. So it's incredibly important that we think about these problems as development challenges and not simply a perpetual humanitarian risk. So the agency's, USAID's resilience work is built on a deep collaboration between the Bureau for Food Security and the Office of Food for Peace, the expanded collaboration with our partners in global health, education, conflict, governance, and we've continued to adapt our approach to dealing with these problem sets as the problem sets have changed, and that's been incredibly powerful. And what's also come of that is some clarity around what actually makes households more resilient, what allows some households and communities to bounce back in the face of shocks and stresses while other households backslide into poverty or don't recover. And the answer is, like the problem, somewhat complex. The sources of resilience, the things that explain why some households and communities fare better than others, actually differ from place to place. There are some core, some sort of core cross-cutting evidence, but it's true that it cuts across sectors. It's about access to finance. It's about healthcare, education. It's also transcends sectors, social capital and the ability to lean on other households, women's empowerment, aspiration, agency, and the ability to shape your own future. All of these are powerful sources of resilience in the face of shocks and stresses. And one of the foremost among them, agriculture, livelihoods, markets. I think there's been somewhat of a misunderstanding about what we're trying to do with resilience at USAID. It's somehow conceived of as a move away from agricultural-led growth. Agricultural-led growth is actually the foundational element of what we're trying to do with our resilience work. Now, the evidence is clear that we have done that successfully in places like northern Kenya, in places like the highlands and lowlands of Ethiopia. The evidence is not yet clear when we lean into these ever more fragile spaces, Eastern DRC, Somalia, Niger and Burkina Faso, sadly now as well, and Mopti. So we haven't proven a model in those more fragile, conflict-affected areas, but we're taking a model that we initially, we started with Feed the Future, which had a solid premise and has delivered incredible results in reducing hunger and poverty and malnutrition in select countries around the world. We adapted that in 2011-12 to areas of recurrent crisis like northern Kenya, like the highlands and lowlands of Ethiopia. And now we're adapting it again, importantly and critically, and as Matt said, without a choice really, to places like northeastern Nigeria, Somalia, northern Burkina Faso, Niger, Mopti region of Mali, etc. So this is about adapting to a changing problem set, and it's at the foremost, at the forefront of how USAID itself is transforming and some of the reorganization that's going on in our agency. I think what's really critical is that we haven't been flat-footed. We have informally adapted and started having conversations between Feed the Future and the Office of Transition Initiatives about how we deal with Niger and Burkina Faso and that complex problem set, bringing stabilization programs together with education, health, and again, at the cornerstone of ag-led growth and agricultural development. but now we're actually changing the structure of the agency. Through this transformation, the Bureau that Beth Dunford and I help lead, the Bureau for Food Security, is becoming the Bureau for Resilience in Food Security. And that's not just wordplay. It's a recognition that not only do we need to lean into fragile, conflict-affected places because that's where we see recurrent humanitarian spending, but this broader phenomena of people backsliding into poverty, et cetera. And so that's an adaptation to a changing world. Through USAID's transformation, we are also establishing something called R3. It's a family of bureaus, and it stands for Relief, Recovery, and Resilience. And it's the bureau, the future bureau that Matt will be a part of, the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, the future Bureau of Resilience and Food Security, and the Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization. So I've often said what we were trying to do with our initial resilience work was cutting against the grain. And what we're doing through transformation is actually changing that grain and making it far easier for us to bring development tools together with conflict prevention and leverage humanitarian footprints to begin to grapple with some of these problems. So again, while we may not be in the heart of Borno State, in the hottest parts of Syria, there is a lot of work we can do in areas that are conflict affected, coming out of conflict, and if we don't do it, Matt and his team are going to be there with humanitarian assistance for the next 20 years. I'm also really, really excited that Thomas Duffy has joined us here today because he makes a critical contribution, I'm sure in your words, but even by your presence, because just as Matt said, humanitarian assistance is necessary but insufficient. The combination of humanitarian development assistance is necessary but still insufficient. We need to take a whole-of-government approach as the U.S. government to this problem set, and we need to encourage and work with partner governments so that they take a whole-of-government approach. If you look at northeastern Nigeria, if you look at Niger, Burkina Faso, these are not solely development problems. These are complex problems that require an integrated whole-of-government approach, again, both by the U.S. government and our partners. And we know that this isn't just a food security issue. This is actually a security issue, a national security issue, our national security and the national security of partner governments with whom we work. So thank you for that, and I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Mr. Collins, that was excellent. Thank you very much for those remarks. Our third speaker to help set the stage for our meeting this morning is Mr. Thomas Duffy. He is the Director of the Office of Agricultural Policy, Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs, U.S. Department of State. Tom comes to AGP after 3 years leading the U.S. mission to the UN agencies in Rome. His other State Department assignments include service as the U.S. Consul General in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, Deputy Consul General at the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem, Political Advisor to the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Manama, Bahrain, and Deputy Political Military Affairs Counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, Iraq. Mr. Thomas Duffy.
Thank you, Chairman Keenan, colleagues, and thank you for addressing this topic. United Nations and those of us in Rome are doing a lot of work on this point, and we think there's a lot of potential to talk about this. I'm also very happy to be here in Des Moines. As Chairman Keenan was saying, I was in Rome for the last 3 years, and I just want to remind you, it's World Food Day. And so at this week in Rome, we also have a lot of events. And sometimes we have the Pope speaking, but I always have problems getting prominent Americans to come to Rome for World Food Day. And I would ask the staff, what's going on? And they would say, they're all in Des Moines. So I'm really happy to be here and see what's taking all my audience away. As both Greg and Matt noted, from a U.S. government perspective, this is a real interagency point. And again, that's a buzzword, but in practice, I mean, my office, both in the State Department, but also our offices overseas, work extremely closely with the Bureau of Food Security and the Office of Food for Peace. It's encouraging, actually, that way, so it's always a pleasure to be on the dais with them. And We wholeheartedly agree with the points colleagues just made. After a decade of steady improvement, the number of hungry people in the world increased over the last 4 years, rising to over 820 million in 2019. And it's clear that conflict, along with climate shocks and economic stability, drives increased hunger. We take special notice that the number of people increasing food insecurity is on the rise. And again, as Matt and Greg pointed out, at the same time, the number of people displaced by violence and conflict has not only reached the highest level since the Second World War, it's gone beyond that. Our approach, we think, has to be twofold. First, we have to work towards ending the conflicts that are driving food insecurity, and that second, we should simultaneously pursue long-term efforts that strengthen local economies and governance in countries at risk of food insecurity. We in the United States are the largest provider of food assistance in the world. In 2018, our emergency food assistance reached more than 68 million people in 58 countries. And we continue to call for all countries to step up their contributions, both financial and political. We find that investments in medium to long-term development can strengthen local economies, support agricultural development, improve nutrition, lessen migration, and enhance early childhood education. If successful, these programs will achieve development outcomes that reduce the need for future humanitarian assistance, promote stability, and reduce the potential for conflict. We face an additional challenge, and that's effective collaboration and communication between the humanitarian and development colleagues on the one side and those who are responsible for international peace and security on the other. For far too long, we've had food security discussions occur in separate spaces. So there's a lot of discussion about the humanitarian development divide and gap, and I think a lot of good work done on that. Colleagues, there's an equally important gap, and that's the gap between the humanitarian development side and the international peace and security side. Humanitarians cannot solve the problems we're talking about alone. Assistance is not going to overcome situations where parties to the conflict block or manipulate humanitarian assistance. Therefore, we think the international community has to work together to promote unimpeded humanitarian access to address the risk of food insecurity and the risk of famine conditions. In recognition of the links between conflict and food security, the United States is proud to have been a co-sponsor of UN Security Council Resolution 2417, which, for the first time in a Security Council resolution, recognizes the link between hunger and conflict. 2417 also creates a reporting mechanism, a reporting requirement, if you read the words of the resolution carefully, for the UN Secretary General to report to the Security Council on pending food security crises linked to conflict. The Security Council Resolution 2417 allows the Council to consider its full range of tools to achieve priorities related to humanitarian access, adherence to international law, and frankly, conflict resolution. As the 2018 Global Report on Food Crises notes, no significant improvement in food security can be expected globally until peace is achieved and livelihoods restored. The 2019 version of the report finds that conflict and insecurity are likely to remain the primary drivers of food security crises during 2019. Our united and coordinated efforts, we think, can reverse the devastating trend of increased food insecurity, particularly crises that are exacerbated by the politics that drive conflict. Look forward to discussions today, and especially raising awareness of Security Council Resolution 2017 and some of the potential in that Security Council resolution. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Well, I think you will agree with me, those were three outstanding presentations to help set the stage for our discussions this morning. I see one of my colleagues with the BIFAD board has joined us this morning, and I would like to have our distinguished board member to stand and introduce himself. is a World Food Prize laureate as well. So we're very, very proud of you and what you do to add to this board and your leadership. Thank you, Gabisa. Okay, we now have our first panel that I would like to introduce the moderator who will be leading our efforts with this panel. This is the State of Knowledge for Fragility, Conflict, and Food Systems is the title of the panel discussion here. And our moderator is Julie Howard. Julie is the Senior Advisor, Global Food Security Project, Center for Strategic and International Studies. Julie is an independent consultant on international development issues with a focus on agricultural development, youth employment, sub-Saharan Africa, and Dr. Howard also served from 2011 to 2014 as the first chief scientist in the Bureau for Food Security at USAID. Dr. Howard will be making opening remarks and provide a more in-depth background on the purpose of the panel. She will then invite her fellow panelists to give a brief presentation. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Julie Howard.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. I'd also like to invite the panelists actually to come up at this time and take their seats. Great. Okay. So we're all here. And good morning to everybody, and thank you, Dr. Keenum, and thank you to the BIFAD for convening what I think is a very, very important discussion. The discussion is timely, I think, as every speaker has said, but the recognition that food and peace are fundamentally intertwined is definitely not new. In 1970, Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work as father of the Green Revolution and credited with saving 1 billion lives, as I think everybody in this room knows. In his Nobel lecture, Dr. Borlaug quoted another Nobel laureate, Lord John Boyd Orr, who is the first Director General of FAO. He said in 1949, "You can't build peace on empty stomachs." Our discussion today is urgently important. After many years of decline, as both Matt and Greg said, hunger is on the increase again, with much of this rise in hunger linked to the increasing prevalence of conflict, often exacerbated by climate change. I want to take us back a bit. Following the 2007-2008 global food price crisis, the U.S. provided critical bipartisan leadership across 2 presidencies that led to a significant reinvestment of country and global resources in the agricultural sectors of low and middle-income countries. The U.S. flagship program, Feed the Future, has compiled a very impressive track record since its inception in 2010. 23.4 million now living above the poverty line, 3.4 children free from stunting, 5.2 million families living free from hunger. These are important results. But in its first phase, and I'm very, very proud to be a part of the team to stand up Feed the Future back then, in its first phase, we, and Feed the Future, we purposefully selected focus countries that were stable, had good governance, and were committed to increasing their own investments in agriculture. But times are changing, as Greg laid out for us. And as its second phase is beginning, Feed the Future has revised its list of focus countries to better reflect this changing tide of global hunger and include more fragile, conflict, and climate-affected countries. Nigeria and Niger are new focus countries, for example, together with ongoing countries, Ethiopia, Mali, Senegal, Uganda, and others. Focus regions within these countries are increasingly including fragile zones, and we are attempting to integrate program with humanitarian partners. We've heard from Greg and Matt about the restructuring of USAID and the restructuring of the Bureau of Food Security to the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. The restructuring is intended to strengthen the link between resilience, food, water, sanitation, and between especially USAID's food security and humanitarian and stabilization efforts. But again, following the 2007-2008 global food price crisis, agricultural development was placed at the very center of U.S. efforts to support country-led economic development priorities. This priority was based on the fact, and it's still true, that the majority of poor people in the world live and work in rural areas and have agriculture-based incomes, livelihoods. Agriculture has been demonstrated over decades in a wealth of studies to be an effective ladder out of poverty. Agricultural development is 2 to 3 times as effective in reducing poverty as investments in other sectors. So now, at this inflection point, we have to ask ourselves, given the changing climate, the political climate, the fragility, how does this approach to supporting agricultural development need to change? What is the role of agriculture, food systems, and food and agriculture-based livelihoods in these fragile, conflict and climate-affected countries and regions? What do we need to do differently or the same as in more stable countries and regions? So our distinguished panel members, and we've really just got a terrific panel for you this morning, they're going to help us out here by reviewing the evidence base. They're going to look at how conflict can disrupt agriculture, and in what ways do food and agricultural systems potentially enable or mitigate conflict. And specifically, here are the 3 things that we're going to try and do in this panel. We're going to review what we know about the relationship between conflict, fragility, food systems, and food-based livelihoods. Secondly, we're going to discuss the implications of this relationship for food security. And third, identify the evidence gaps in our understanding of these relationships. So let me briefly introduce our panelists and their topics. You can find their full bios included with your agenda with the morning program. I'll invite each panelist to the stage to provide a 10-minute presentation, and then if there's time afterwards, I'll moderate a brief discussion here on stage with the panelists before turning to a discussion, a lively discussion, I hope, with BIFAD, first turning to BIFAD, and then to audience members. So first, on my right, on your left, Emmy Simmons, who is a senior advisor in the Global Food Security Project at the Center for the Strategic and International Studies. And Emmy's going to focus on key statistics and trends over time across major kinds of conflict. To Emmy's right, Colin Hendricks is a professor at the Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver and also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute in Washington. Colin's presentation will focus on the political economy of conflict and food security. Next, Leanne Erdberg-Stedman, who is now the director of the Countering Violent Extremism program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She's going to speak just on that topic, the challenges of countering violent extremism, especially among youth. And then finally, but definitely not least, we have Soji Adelaja, who is the Hanna Distinguished Professor in Land Policy at Michigan State University. And Soji is going to focus on future research needs and the example of Boko Haram. So let me invite Emmy to the stage now.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks to all of you who invited us here to sort of kick off part of the World Food Prize discussion with, I think, a really timely topic. I'm going to try to figure out the next slide. Yes. As Julie said, I've been charged with talking about key statistics and trends across time and major conflicts. Matt has already introduced a number of the facts and figures that go into responding to conflict these days, the number of people who are hungry, the number of people who are displaced. And the numbers are truly amazing when you put them out. They're large, they're like, how can we ever deal with this? But remember that in World War II, 70 to 85 million people were killed or died within a period of 5 or 6 years. That's a lot. At the end of 2018, as Matt said, 70 million people, however, today were displaced by war, violence, and persecution. The same number as were killed in all of World War II. That's an astonishing, to me, comparison. I find these numbers, in fact, are very hard to grasp and sort of give a reality. So in my little introductory piece here, I'm going to try to give a little bit of kind of feel for a little bit further down into the trends, the statistics, what makes them up, how do we do that kind of analysis that both Matt and Greg talked about. I want to start with Nigeria, sort of linking to our last speaker, Soji Adelaja. I moved to Nigeria in 1969, in the middle of the Biafran War, a war in which there was huge conflict between the ethnic groups in the southeast and groups in the rest of the country with regard to access, I can't quite read my thing here, with regard to access and control of oil. But that wasn't the only element of conflict in Nigeria in 1967 to 70. Also, as part of it were religious conflicts, what we would today call religious extremism perhaps, and just a general set of uncertainties having to do with the fact that Nigeria only became independent in 1960 and had not really kind of gelled, as it were, into a nation. So the numbers were amazing. I mean, we again found great kinds of numbers with regard to the people affected by the Biafran War. There were 100,000 military deaths in that period of 3 to 4 years, but as many as 2 million people are estimated to have died of starvation. And I moved to Nigeria. I went to Ahmadu Bello University in the north, in Zaria, Nigeria, and yet for me, for my friends, for the university, for the folks in Zaria, 800, 1,000 miles from the conflict, the front line of the conflict, we were able, in fact, to carry on a normal life and to contain sort of what we did from the horrors that were going on in southeast Nigeria. I was back in Nigeria a few years ago in Ibadan at IITA, and I found the same kind of containing kind of action and thinking going on with regard to what was happening in northeast Nigeria. People in Ibadan said, well, it's far away, you know, whatever. It's hard to grasp the enormity of the challenges and the enormity of the suffering that are going on. Today, I think we're seeing sporadic violence pretty much across Nigeria again. And in fact, Julie shared a trip report from someone who was just in Niger and finding that Nigerians are now flowing across the border in western Nigeria. And this is in Maradi, one of my favorite places to visit in Niger. And so again, it's this issue of how do you grasp this? How do you give this reality? I know, Matt, you know how to do this, but it is hard. And even in Nigeria, 50 years after the Biafran War ended, 50 years, we're seeing people flying the Biafran flag. At election time, we see people stepping up and saying, you know, we shouldn't be part of Nigeria. We need more control over the oil revenue. The extra 15% we're getting of national revenues are not enough. So let me just turn to another one. This one I saw from the distance of Nairobi. But in 1994, again, apparently very suddenly, Rwanda exploded in conflict. And within a very few days, a week, you saw on the nightly news in Nairobi these long queues of people walking from Kigali, walking from Rwanda, going into the Eastern Congo. Ethnic violence exploded, literally exploded. And people sort of knew that there were these tensions, but the anticipation of this sort of sudden outbreak seemed to catch everyone, including our colleagues in USAID, by surprise. But I think more importantly, the disastrous effects of hunger, the disastrous effects of displacement, also spilled over into neighboring countries, thereby creating uncertainty, disruption all over Eastern Congo. And 25 years after the genocide, Rwanda is apparently on its way to recovery, on its way to healing under the strong leadership of Kagame, with ag-led growth being an important part of the recovery pattern. But we still find in DRC thousands of people who fled Rwanda back in 1994 and are still displaced. So today, I think everybody has said the time is up. I mean, the moment is now. We are still facing ongoing challenges with refugees. That's my phone, and I'm sorry, I forgot to turn it on. Just let it, Louise, just let it ring. Refugees, we have internally displaced people, we have humanitarian crises. West Africa has kind of a series of outbreaks of violence and conflict. We have, as this picture shows, we have more than 2 million IDPs, internally displaced people, associated with northeastern Nigeria. And there's another aspect of the statistics and the trends, which is not perhaps as well explained, is that women and children are perhaps bear the greatest impact from the challenge of conflict. So it's important, as I say, to remember that the negative consequences of conflict go far beyond battle deaths. Remember the number from the Biafran War. 100,000 killed in battle, that's a lot. But up to 2 million probably dying of starvation, that's even more. The human impacts of conflict are almost unimaginable. The intergenerational effects of conflict that are experienced through malnutrition, lost years of education, what you referred to as kind of the tearing of the social fabric, that communities fall apart. In Rwanda, it was literally true. Neighbors killed neighbors. The human impact is, again, one of these things which is almost unimaginable, but I guess the point of my mentioning it is that we do need to come to grips with this. It is important. Sorry, Louise, can you?
I'll take her out of the room.
Sorry, I am so sorry. I meant to do that. The other negative consequence of conflict has to do with loss of assets in food and agriculture, corruption emerging as people seek to profiteer. And then, as Julie mentioned, I think the bottom line is the destruction and disruption of food systems. What we have found in terms of trends is that international conflicts have absolutely decreased. If you look at sort of the top on the 1940s, 1950s, it's just the trend is really down. But new conflict trends have emerged. That great emerging yellow space there is civil war, where both state and non-state actors engage in violence and death. Extremist religious violence is part of it. Communal violence is also a trend that we are seeing. You mentioned the herder-farmer conflicts. And we are also seeing increasingly political conflict, sometimes associated with electoral systems, sometimes just a competition for the spoils of gaining access. There's a new emphasis on data and information, and in analyzing these, and I don't have time to go into these, but we have a number of groups that are now doing an amazing job of trying to present the numbers, understand what lies below them in terms of drivers and impacts, and then bring that analysis to the local context to actually help us understand what might be the most appropriate measures to address and mitigate the effects of conflicts. I find that there are a number of questions that I hear constantly being asked. How are natural resources distributed? Does everyone have access to what they need for food and agricultural livelihoods? Are youth finding adequate job opportunities? Is the purchasing power that people have, especially in rural areas, based upon their earnings, enough to meet their food needs? How are people managing climate change? Do health care services, are they available? And are they actually meeting needs for managing reproductive health? How is urbanization being managed? Are property rights clear, secure? Do national institutions and local institutions provide adequate justice? Or do people feel as though they're being discriminated against unfairly? Are military and police forces ensuring physical security? So what we're seeing is all of those factors, as you talked about before, are driving and complicating and creating a picture of complex, which is locally specific, but which brings into play a whole bunch of issues that are not just one little thing or two little things where a quick injection of food assistance will help everybody get through that problem. I consistently look at the international connections through trade and in food and agriculture commodities as being an important part of the response. International trade has really helped to solve the sort of larger problem of food insecurity over the last 30 years. But we've also seen that there are negative impacts associated with global food trade. Julie has already mentioned in 2007, 2008, market and price volatility and the impact that it had on low-income consumers in low-income countries and the way that contributed to violence. We also have seen the imposition of tariff and non-tariff barriers disrupting food and agricultural trade and to some extent exacerbating conflict between neighbors. We've seen terms of trade declared to be unfair and generating what I consider to be sort of perverse policy reactions in terms of, well, we need to protect our own farmers because those more competitive farmers in other countries are trying to take advantage of us. Trade dependence is seen in some cases as a moral failing, and leaders avoid being seen as not supporting food security. And then finally, even when humanitarian aid is available, food, as it has been since every world war in the 20th century, can be very easily weaponized. And I'm sure Matt could talk about that at length. So quick conclusions. As Matt and as Greg have both, and Thomas Duffy as well, have all said, we need new response paradigms. We need to understand what's going on simultaneously across different sectors and not to just think about a sequential response that, well, we'll wait till the peace accord is signed and then we'll come in with development assistance. That is no longer a viable approach. We need to recognize the importance of food and agriculture, as Julie has mentioned, in conflict-affected areas. I believe, this is a point of contention with some of my colleagues, that we actually need to use food and agricultural systems investments as a way of averting conflict and really reducing the social unrest and potential for violent conflict. And I'm looking forward to Soji's views on that. And finally, as has been mentioned, we need to undertake deeper analysis. We now have a much more rich set of data to use. We have many people who are now, and Leanne will be talking about this, who are really digging into understanding what makes for peace, what makes for reduction of extremist ideas, and how do we mobilize that analysis to shape, to target, and to intervene in more effective ways. So thank you.
Thanks, Emmy, for kicking off the discussion. That was, I think, a great sort of painting of the enormity of the challenge, but also helping us start to think about the ways in which conflict differs today than it used to differ, and how that begins to inform how our approach must also be different. Now, I'm going to ask Helen. I think I was thinking of Thomas's presentation and basically saying food security can no longer be discussed in a room all by itself, food security experts, but really has to invite in others, many others. But I think Cullen's going to get to the heart of the political economy. Right? Why does that need to be such an important part of the discussion and the solution? Cullen.
Great. Thank you very much, Julie, and thank you all for being here this morning. My role in this discussion is to sort of broach the subject of the political economy of food insecurity and conflict, with particular emphasis first on how food insecurity is a driver of both violent conflict and less violent, but potentially no less politically consequential protest movements, on the one hand, and two, how conflict itself can be a driver of food insecurity. In doing so, I'm going to try and highlight what I believe is an under-discussed issue in the way we think about food systems and agricultural development, which is that there are potential tensions between two different notions of food security. So food security is a component of human security, which is the most conventional definition, and that definition that drives most of our agricultural development and humanitarian response policies, so the kind of space we're talking about today. But also food security is a component of national security, national economic interests, and domestic political power. This tension indicates we need to think about the domestic politics of agricultural-led development programs particularly as many countries with high food insecurity are undergoing rapid urbanization. So when we talk about issues like water and food security, our thoughts are often dominated by images of small plot farmers, sometimes tending to fields and children at the same time, or herders who are inhabiting lands beset by water stress. Many of these farmers are women, and many are either food insecure or very close to it. This mental image conjures a specific set of challenges related to agricultural production, livelihoods, and agricultural marketing. The resulting discussions tend to be dominated by rural development, poverty, and food security concerns. And while this is a life that many in the developing world lead and will continue to lead for the foreseeable future, the reality of food and water-related challenges in developing regions of the world are changing. Africa is urbanizing at rates not seen since Latin America in the 1950s and 1960s, and this rapid urbanization is fueling economic growth and dynamism, especially in the service sector. But it's also presenting new challenges for food and water systems in the region. Having left the farm, these new urbanites are by definition becoming more dependent on local, regional, and global markets for satisfying their food needs. And they are increasingly vocal when those needs are not met. So here we see an image taken from the recent protest that resulted in the ouster of Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, protest in which food prices and the government's inability to control them were central to those mass mobilizations. As we think about how to effectively merge the goals of humanitarian response and agricultural development, we must be increasingly cognizant of the strong linkages between food insecurity and conflict, both in rural areas, which we've been discussing at relative length so far, but also increasingly in urban spaces. So what exactly are those linkages and feedbacks? Briefly, as this has been covered relatively well so far, I will make three kind of overarching observations regarding the relationships between food insecurity and conflict. The first is that while increases in food security can be a source of grievances that motivate participation in rebellion or other types of armed movements, acute and severe food insecurity actually have a dampening effect on participation and conflict behavior. Second, communal conflicts, such as the ones we'll talk about in a moment in the middle belt of Nigeria, tend to occur against a backdrop of chronic food insecurity, though the effects of rapid changes in food access are less clear in these kinds of environments. So again, trying to set the evidentiary base. And then third, regarding urban unrest, the picture is somewhat more straightforward. Higher consumer prices and food shortages, particularly for staple goods, are associated with increase in urban protests and rioting, which can have adverse effects for institutions and influence policy decisions that affect the whole country. However, it's usually not the most food insecure in urban spaces that are protesting or rioting, but those with comparatively better access. This is partly because of the interaction between these dynamics and other variables such as political regimes, which affect the likelihood of that demonstrations or riots will be repressed, and incentives for governments to shield consumers from high prices in either global or regional markets. Equally important is the role of weak institutions, whose presence implies that there are few mechanisms through which conflicts can be managed. In each of these cases, though, I want to argue that there's some cyclical kind of dynamics, because the resulting instability can cause further price increases, reduce access, and therefore fuel this kind of cyclical opposite of a virtuous cycle, right? A downward spiral continuing to further fuel conflict dynamics. Okay. These types of linkages between food insecurity and rebellion, food insecurity and communal conflict, and food insecurity and urban protest can all be fleshed out by looking at the example of Nigeria, Africa's most populous country. So in northeast Nigeria, the rise of Boko Haram was fueled in part by food insecurity, and the conflict itself has had disastrous effects for local food systems. Leanne may discuss this further in detail, but unemployment, idleness, and a lack of consistent access to food and the promise of food and shelter are some of the most common motivations for young, and particularly men, joining rebel movements, gangs, and militias, including those with ostensibly religious motivations. Boko Haram's attacks on farming and fishing communities in northeastern Nigeria have had disastrous consequences for local food production systems in areas already buffeted by the effects of lake recession and climate change. In Nigeria's middle belt, communal conflict between herders and farmers has actually surpassed the Boko Haram insurgency as the most lethal and population-displacing conflict in the country over the past 2 years. The middle belt is Nigeria's breadbasket and the primary source of domestic grain, cattle, and milk production. Domestic production of all three of these has been cut significantly as farmers abandon plots and herders lose livestock. Communal conflicts can escalate to larger civil wars, as was the case in the Darfur case, when the government is perceived to be supporting, tacitly or otherwise, one communal group at the expense of another. And finally, these conflict dynamics are affecting policies in Nigeria's urban metropolises, which are feeling the effects of both rising prices due to conflict-related production cuts, but also well-intentioned policies such as import taxes and import bans designed to help stimulate these lagging sectors of the economy. This last month was the first in over a year not characterized by high food price inflation, and both the Buhari and previous Jonathan administrations have seen recurrent urban protests over food prices and threats to subsidy programs. These three types of instability are interlinked, and while we've thought a lot about the first two types of conflict, we've thought less about how they are affected by conflict dynamics in urban settings and the policy responses that unrest in urban settings often invite. Finally, it's important to note that conflict can dramatically reshape local agricultural economies and have large spillover effects for food and livelihood systems far from where the fighting takes place, and pursuant to a point that was made earlier, in regions where we can actually invest in policy innovation that is designed to make those adjacent systems much more resilient so that we can move into spaces that are conflict affected once conflict dynamics recede. So I've looked at these dynamics most closely in Uganda, where the conflict in the north between the Ugandan government and the Lord's Resistance Army resulted in mass displacement, both into settlements but also to Uganda's southern regions, far from fighting, and towards the lake shore, this is Lake Victoria, where displaced young men and women or urban workers who were actually displaced in the urban environment by this influx of population could take part in the open access fisheries there. Displacement drove a rapid increase in fishing pressure, which correlates very highly with the increase in internal displacement. And now, 10 years after the waning of that conflict, Uganda's Lake Victoria fisheries and the over 1 million livelihoods associated therewith are severely stressed. That is, the food system that became a coping mechanism for the displaced has tipped over into instability due to pressure that emanated from the conflict in the north, a conflict that had absolutely nothing to do with fish in the first place. This example is emblematic of the way we need to account for the complex ways conflict reshapes local economies and agricultural/food systems. So in conclusion, I would just like to make a couple of brief comments. One is to not bury the lead. There are significant negative feedbacks between food insecurity and conflict, whereby food insecurity exacerbates conflict, which further exacerbates food insecurity and affects linked economies and food systems. Second, the effects vary across conflict types, and policy responses to one type may exacerbate the other types. So the types of policy responses that have been well-intentioned to promote rural agricultural development in many of these environments are, in cases like Nigeria, but more broadly, associated with an increase in protest and rioting in the urban spaces due to concerns about relative balance of the benefits of economic development for rural dwellers versus urban dwellers. There are significant knowledge gaps in how agricultural transformations lead to knowledge-intensive development. This is something I didn't flag in my main remarks, but something I hope we have an opportunity to talk about later. When we think about agricultural-led development and the transformation of economies, mental model that we're bringing to the table is one largely derived from Asian context, and in particular East Asian context, where agricultural-led development provides a basis for industrialization and the development of an urban, industrialized, manufacturing-based export economy. Africa, in particular, is urbanizing in ways that are unprecedented. It's urbanizing in ways where the primary form of urban employment has been in the service sector and not necessarily translating to the same type of exportable goods or export-oriented economies that might make for a more sustainable kind of basis moving forward. So that's a challenge we need to be thinking about, and it's not one that we understand well. Fourth, agricultural development policies must be conflict sensitive, but they also need to be politically sensitive. Because when push comes to shove, many of our partners in countries where USAID is operating are going to choose their own political stability and their own ability to stay in office over the best intentioned policies that might spur rural development. And that brings us back to where we began, between this tension between the two food insecurities, or the two food securities. One, food security as an element of human development, and the second, food security as an element of national power and political survival. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to a robust discussion.
Thanks, Colin. That was fascinating, and it seems like we should have like a 5-hour discussion on all the things that you raised. Really interesting points on urbanization and how that really affects rural-urban relationships, how we need to think about the political dynamics of that. And then that last point that you raised, you know, urbanization and economic development is almost happening in a job-free way, which has a lot of implications for youth, of course. And so we turn to Leanne, who's going to talk about extremism and factors that drive extremism, but also I think talk a little bit about some of the approaches to address extremism and inject a note of positive hope into our approaches. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. And I have to admit, when I first got the call from a colleague at USAID who said, would you come to BIFAD in Des Moines? I said, are you sure you have the right phone number? What am I doing here? But after listening to all of the opening remarks and learning more from my fellow co-panelists, I feel like there is actually a very important conversation to be had between those who look at terrorism and violent extremism and those who spend their time on food security. So I'm delighted to be able to talk a bit about this today. So the first point has been made a bit by others as well, and this is just too often terrorism and food insecurity are happening in the same time at the same place. This is a map from the Global Terrorism Index, and they have an algorithm that looks at the impact of terrorism through a variety of different ways. It's not just the number of deaths and the number of attacks, but also the number of economic costs that a society is incurring because of violent extremism. So not only this is the index from 2017, not only were there 67 countries that suffered at least one terrorist attack that resulted in death, but there was also $52 billion of estimated economic impact from the cost of terrorism. These are just the direct costs. What is not calculated, but the report highlights, is the opportunities lost for economic growth, for livelihoods, for tourism, for youth to have an economic potential. That these are far larger costs that are much more difficult to calculate. And my other panelists have said this a lot better than I did, but I thought that this was a really useful map to show about emergency food in a world marked by violent extremism. The sheer number of people that are in need of emergency food is enormous in the areas that are also co-located with violent extremists and terrorist groups. 80% of the world's humanitarian needs, assessed at over $25 billion in 2018, are driven by conflict. This is also an incomplete picture because this is not taking into account insecure supply routes and all of the opportunity costs for new growth that are not starting because of this type of insecurity. So the cost in both the financial and human terms is simply not sustainable. Others, including U.S. government colleagues, said this much more eloquently than I can, but it is time to break the costly cycle of perpetual crisis response and think about how do we prevent conflict and extremism at its roots. That leaves us asking a lot more questions about how do we transform these existing conditions in order to restart the types of sustainable development to include indigenous food production and trade. With that in mind, I thought that I would speak a little bit to unpacking what in my field of study are known as social contracts. And I have stolen almost every graphic in this presentation because other people have done it better than I have, and I will borrow and cite heavily. But this I felt to be a very useful way of explaining the social contract. This is a little bit about how communities and governments interact with each other, but also the processes by which they interact, namely political processes in a given context. I think this is incredibly important in the field of terrorism because terrorists operate by making a very compelling case that the status quo is illegitimate, and everyone who is responsible for that status quo is also illegitimate, and there is only one way to a more sustainable status quo, and that way is this incredibly violent overthrow of the status quo. And so because of that, that narrative is present in almost all of today's major terrorist groups, and that the social contract is implicated in the way in which they radicalize and recruit, and also the way in which they govern when they are able to hold land and territory, as many of the groups that have been mentioned today have been able to do at certain moments in time. So these social contracts are incredibly useful to understanding why is the status quo in that social contract so broken? Why are people willing to join armed, violent, and groups to supplant the existing status quo? And so it's a very helpful framing concept on how terrorists exploit this and how we think about these two-way conversations between government and citizen instead of making them an all-or-nothing violent siege. And my best way of describing this to somebody who spends no time in this space is to ask, you know, when we think of fragile places, and my next slide, I'll get into this a little bit more, but when you ask an ordinary person, when something bad happens to you or your family, do you call the police or are you afraid of the police? And I think that's a really interesting indicator to think about what fragility means in practice in a lot of these places. Is the police going to shake you down for money? Are you going to have to pay an exorbitant amount of money to ever see your day in court? Are your family members going to be jailed indefinitely in pre-trial detention? Are you going to be noted by the government as being a disruptor in a specific case? So I think that there are ways in which we think about that social contract is very tangible in a lot of the most fragile places. And in many places, it's just that the police are hundreds, if not thousands of miles away before they could ever come to mediate any of the types of conflicts that we're seeing. So several years before I joined the U.S. Institute of Peace, we were co-hosting what was known as a fragility study group, and they talk about fragility as really being this absence or breakdown of the social contract. I think that this study group started to lay the foundation for a task force that was established in 2017, and it was chaired by the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission, Governor Kane and Congressman Hamilton, and they came together to talk about extremism in fragile states. The idea that there is a breakdown of this social contract in fragile states, and it has resulted in societal fragmentation and grievances that have been exploited by violent extremists, by those like ISIS and Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda and their affiliates. So the question is, why does extremism differ in fragile states? And I'm not supposed to put this many words on a slide, but I was going to do a poor job at paraphrasing what this task force on extremism in fragile states was able to do when we talk about extremism. Because one of the ways in which extremism is manifesting in fragile states is that it is not only a supplant of the existing political order, but it is incredibly authoritarian, and it is incredibly black and white. It is my way or the highway. It's absolutionist. And I think that that is incredibly important as to why we see these social contracts, because what this means for youth, there's 1.8 billion youth worldwide that are living in areas that are impacted by conflict. The predominant narrative in a lot of these places is depicting young men as perpetrators of violence and young women as victims. And when it comes to terrorism prevention, I think too many people see youth as an at-risk community instead of the innumerable ways that they represent huge opportunities for the future. So when violent extremists and how they manifest, there are too many paths and it defies a single profile, but I thought I would give a little bit of depth into how they operate. And my favorite thing to say about terrorist groups is they're incredibly opportunistic. And so I show Maslow's hierarchy of needs to talk about there are terrorist groups in many different places around the world that are saying that if you have a deficiency in any of these places, in your physiological needs, your safety needs, your love, belonging, esteem, or self-actualization needs, there is an answer for you in our group. And so one of the things that this task force on extremism in fragile states was able to show is that there are certain conditions that make violent extremism much easier for terrorists to exploit. A sense of injustice, a sense of political exclusion, the organizational presence of terrorists in the neighborhood, so to speak. And so when you have this opportunistic terrorist group, plus these conditions for extremism, building resilience, especially for youth, is incredibly difficult. And so one of the ways in which we think that the task force was trying to advocate for is a much more inclusive approach that involves building a variety of different partnerships with leaders in government and civil society and the private sector and with women and youth who are committed to building peace and governing accountably. Because building resilience is not straightforward, but it can be achieved, especially if it's looked at across many sectors, across many stakeholders. But some of these precautionary investments in social cohesion, in governance, in building trust between people and their government are not easy things to start, but there's a variety of different sectoral approaches that can have governance dividends. And so when we think of if we think about youth as part of this particular way, they can be agents for positive change in building cohesion, in developing new types of governance processes and different types of consultations, and increasing that trust between the citizen and the state. We can be equipping them with the knowledge and skills to enable a more secure and prosperous future. And the reason that I'm so optimistic, but I think not naive, is that violent extremism at its core is a deeply human problem. It only exists as long as new people are able to join. And so when we think about prevention as a policy against extremism, I find, perhaps the culmination of this short presentation is, so what does food security and agriculture have to do with this type of prevention of violent extremism? And I think there's a lot of different ways in which we can see global changes across the development spectrum, but the roads to stronger social contracts are numerous and varied, but I have hypothesized a couple potential areas for this conversation. The one is around building trust between governments and citizens on shared collective challenges, like food and agriculture. For instance, corruption is one of the most prominent ways in which terrorists recruit across the globe. So anti-corruption efforts in the food and trade space could show how anti-corruption is possible as a vector of social contracts to repair one part of how governments and citizens are able to interact with each other. On climate change and shocks, which others have spoken much more eloquently than me, I think that there's a way in which terrorists are making a radical narrative that they are recruiting people to be part of their cause to change this entire status quo. But some of the impacts that they get is that there's group identity and shared cause and constructive engagement as part of their narrative. And so there are ways in which those youth that are looking to make an impact on climate change could be doing that in a much more positive way. I will say that the governance gains are incremental, but there's a lot of opportunities for these ways to show results. The last thing that I'll end on is that there is an increase over the last several years of the humanitarian, the development, and the peace-building community seeing an integrated nexus, that these are not siloed approaches to how we understand conflict in fragile places, but they all have to be working hand in hand. And so in these complex ecosystems, and Colin got into quite a bit of the complexity that exists in the choices that we make, but the more that we see the humanitarian, the development, and the peace-building spaces with a prevention mindset together, the more we see increases for peace and prosperity. Thank you.
Thanks, Leanne. So that was so helpful, to understand better what the nature of the social compact is, and then also to sort of lead us into thinking about the ways in which agriculture and food security and the ways that we design programs might help to rebuild that. Really fascinating. Okay, Soji, over to you. I'm going to say we're running a bit behind on time, so I think I'm going to reluctantly dispense with my prerogative to ask questions of the panel, because I personally hate being in the audience and not having any time for questions. So right after Soji's presentation, I'll turn first to BIFAD members for questions, and then to general audience. Yeah. So Soji, please.
It's hard to be the last speaker, especially when others have been so eloquent and precise and have provided very good information. And so maybe I can save us some time, a little bit of time, by just zeroing in on things that are perhaps the most important in my presentation. I also want to apologize in advance that I'm nursing a cold or flu. I can't figure it out. It started last night, and also an earache. So if I don't sound coherent, it's because anyway, let me start by saying that I mostly, through my career, worked on domestic U.S. land use, land policy issues, and knew nothing about food security, development, international work until, like Amy, I went to Nigeria in 2011. It's my birth country. I thought I was going there to help. Ended up in the presidency as special advisor on economic intelligence, looking to do real development work, just helping with regional development type issues. I quickly found out that conflict was the biggest deterrent to development. And in fact, the one thing that could unravel the country was indeed the various conflicts around the country. I also very quickly discovered that there was no evidence base whatsoever on the role of conflict. In fact, decision makers were mostly focused on doing what they normally do. There was no research, nothing. So it turned out that I had to do quick sit on the pants research quickly to help convince even decision makers that conflict is a big challenge and food security is important, that there are root causes to conflict, and so on and so forth. And so my presentation today is based partly on my experience there, but also my research since I came back. What started as a one-year sabbatical turned out to be a 5-year ordeal, and so on. But you know, so many others, particularly our distinguished panelists, have talked a lot about many dimensions of this nexus between conflict and food security and agriculture and development and so on and so forth. I thought I'd start the discussion here with this diagram that is kind of a researcher's perspective, right? There are things, including climate change, that Greg talked about earlier, that can throw a country out of some degree of stability. And depending on the veracity of those things, as one of my papers has shown, it can take you far in the conflict spectrum. Things like terrorism, domestic and international battles that cost a lot of lives, I see those as wicked conflicts. And if the system is pushed far enough, you can get into that, what I call the crisis zone, where things become intractable. And then, of course, the mass displacements, the humanitarian challenges, and resettlement challenges, post-conflict resettlement issues then come in, their impacts on agriculture and land, on all of these things. The value of research is to actually inform not only preventative strategies, but also conflict management strategies, and then how we handle this humanitarian economic challenges that result from conflict. So the purpose of this slide is just to demonstrate that there are research gaps all over the place, in my opinion, across the entire spectrum. So in my presentation today, I'm just going to basically try, excellent, okay. And I'm just going to basically try to quickly explain what we know, and some of these have already been mentioned, and then talk about what we don't know. What do we know about the relationship between food insecurity and conflict? Does food insecurity cause conflict? We know for a fact that it does.
Yes, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. It does. The evidence is very scanty. We can get into technical details about the relationship between food insecurity and conflict, like different aspects of food insecurity, like availability, food access. And so we do know that almost all the evidence that exists suggests that there's a causal relationship between food insecurity and conflict. But we also know that other factors contribute to conflict, unemployment, youth unemployment, a variety of things. Studies that have been done on this say this very, very clearly. Are those studies enough? They're certainly not enough because they're contextual, they're focused on specific countries. In some cases, we need to know more about places that are likely to be in crisis as opposed to places that were in crisis that we're studying post, ex post. I think another important thing to note is that terrorists tend to target agricultural areas and food markets because they have a particular interest in those areas. First of all, territorial terrorists, which I've spent a bit of time studying, the literature shows that they themselves want to create disruptions that generate IDPs and generate the need for humanitarian assistance, and one of the things that they need fertilizer, for example, to help in their manufacturing of bombs and things of that nature. And so they have a particular interest in food insecurity and in agriculture. Agriculture is in their way, so to speak. Does conflict adversely impact on agriculture? A lot of studies, I'm sorry, I keep doing this. A lot of studies are suggesting that that is the case. We know that the impacts are across the board. It changes how farmers act and behave. It affects their production. Labor productivity is reduced. Hired labor is reduced. Daily wages reduced. Agricultural markets are destroyed. Agricultural extension services are destroyed. Input and agricultural investments go down. Of course, the evidence is from multiple different countries, and we need a more concerted way of understanding what the literature suggests. So agriculture is adversely impacted by conflict. What about food security? Conflict contributes to food insecurity, and conflict compromises the nutritional status of children. There are a number of studies that have shown that. It adversely affects other food insecurity measures, increases food insecurity in Nigeria. We actually in Nigeria did a study where we looked at things such as the number of days that the household relied on less preferred foods and the reduction in the variety of foods that they eat, the reduction in the portion of size of meals consumed. That's an article coming out in the American Journal of Ag Economics, or is already out in the American Journal of Ag Economics. So we do know that food insecurity is impacted. We do need information to design conflict prevention programs, crisis management programs. Data and research are needed to design post-crisis intervention programs, humanitarian assistance programs, and things of that nature. And one other thing, I think it's important to also recognize that the literature has identified the gender implications and youth implications. I think Colin talked about this a little bit earlier, and so on. So let me just move on and say, what are the knowledge gaps? In the area of food security and resilience, I think we need to learn more or do more work on the sources of food security resilience and the implications for humanitarian assistance, foreign aid, and resilience. The available data in conflict zones is not reliable, and in fact, the data often doesn't exist. We need to do a lot better in actually being able to measure the implications of crisis, predict the implications of crisis, particularly if it's possible to use satellite data to do some of these things. It's very difficult to get active in a conflict zone to gather information. We need to understand the differential impacts of conflict on women, children, and so on and so forth. We need to understand the difference between climate and conflict shocks. I think that's very, very important. We need to do more in understanding the agricultural market, value chain, sales network, support programs, implications for extension, things of that nature. The agricultural input supply implications of conflict. Specific crop impacts. Our study was one of our studies was one that focused on crop impacts, but we need more in specific contexts beyond just just Nigeria. The internal trade and international trade implications and the implications for global prices, and then land tenure rights implications. We need to know more about early warning systems, because of course conflict prevention is extremely important. To prevent conflict, we need to be in a position to actually advise those that are monitoring the environment or monitoring society for potential for crisis to be able to develop better tools to actually identify the possibility of conflict emerging. And then, of course, another area is the farmer-herder area. Give me one more minute, and I think I'll be done. One big area is this area of resettlement, rehabilitation, and redevelopment. We tend to think that most people who kind of run away from conflict zones eventually go back home. The evidence from Nigeria is suggesting that they don't. The majority of them don't. And they create problems in their host communities. By the way, most IDPs do not live in IDP camps, they live in host communities. And they almost permanently stress those communities. And those communities have no way whatsoever to cope with the challenges. So we need to know more about what are the barriers to returning farm. What does the agricultural economy look like in those places that have been abandoned as a result of conflict? What can we plan for as we think about the future agriculture and food situation in those places? How do we address, again, the IDPs that never go back home? What are the incentives that could be put in place to help them maybe integrate or develop their entrepreneurial skills? The ones that don't go back home often tend to be the ones that have better opportunities, better connections, and better resources. So what can we do to kind of help them? And NGOs and CSOs have a significant role to play, in post-conflict environments. We need to think about those kinds of things. I'm personally interested in this whole issue of radicalization and de-radicalization. We find that women oftentimes are less prone to radicalization, so we need to be thinking about what roles they could play in kind of creating an environment that's more risky and dangerous. And of course, the youth issue is important. Let me close, and I apologize for my code. I think my first conclusion is that agriculture is key to transforming developing economies and reducing poverty. And how we will prevent and manage conflict will determine the future development potential of many countries. When I went to Nigeria, I had no clue that conflict would be my #1 biggest problem, and it was. Effective policies and program interventions require strong knowledge base, and I think that the volume of work that's needed to fill the gap is so significant that we need to be thinking seriously about a fast-track gap-filling research program, almost like a SWAT team kind of an approach, because a lot of decisions are being made that cost billions of dollars in the humanitarian aspect and on the prevention aspect, that quite frankly, to do good quality work, one needs to actually rely on good quality data. One thing I also observed trying to build the CTD team at Michigan State University is that academics are reluctant to work with the security sector, with defense folks, but they're very eager to work with USAID, maybe because of the aid focus of USAID's work or development focus. So there's an opportunity inherent in USAID and Bureau of Food Security and Resilience to actually maybe drive academic work and non-academic work. And then I wanted to close by also talking about the work I did in Nigeria was focused, I was housed in the Office of the National Security Advisor, but at the presidency. And the people who are planning for stability, we're not talking to people who work in areas whose work can impact on national security, right? And I think much of what we do, or some of the things that we need to be thinking about, how do you get the food security experts and national security experts to at least get together and start thinking that maybe food security is a mechanism by which you can manage national security. We need more research to actually support that kind of work. I'm sorry that I took too much time, and thank you. Thanks. Thank you. 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 T
Thanks, Soji, for I think valiantly trying to summarize, what we do and don't know, and where we need to focus. And I think also I want to thank you particularly, for bringing us back to, the conundrum, the real challenges faced by government, national, regional, local leaders who are the real focus for our efforts, not academic journals and not even USAID and other development agency leaders. So thank you for that on the ground, from the ground perspective. So I want to open it now. I'm going to ask Dr. Keenum, if I may please claim back, I think we started 5 minutes late, so if I could claim back those 5 minutes. But to open it for questions, first from BIFAD, and then I think from others, and I think let's just go quickly gathering questions, and then we'll give the panelists their best shot at responding to the ones that they think they would like to comment on. Please.
And I want to commend the panel because I thought it was fabulous orchestration of ideas from beginning to end. Emmy Simmons opened up by calling attention to the historical perspective by which we need to view what we're seeing today. I would just reemphasize that and say we desperately need that, and that needs to permeate what we're doing in our educational settings and our universities. And when you conclude with Soji's last comments here regarding the need for basically a Marshall Plan for research, which I would totally agree with, and in contrast to our previous Marshall Plan, it's a much more complex world today, requiring a great deal of focus on youth and on the political dimensions of every component that is being undertaken in the field, which I think we don't give enough attention to, and particularly not in understanding it academically. Thanks.
Thank you.
Pamela Anderson. Again, thank you all for sharing your time and your experiences. One of the things that's been so frustrating being a researcher dealing with these issues is that the fragmentation that we've been suffering. And one of the things that several of you have said explicitly, and all of you have implied, is that we need to get beyond that. Part of what we dealt with in the research community for decades is being told, get back in your box. So every time there was a crisis, and we did have tools and we tried to come out and respond to it, we weren't allowed to, literally. I tried to set up a rapid response unit at SIP. Why? 9 of the CG centers have gene banks. We have the maps and the data of what staple foods people eat where. When there's a crisis, what we wanted to do is go in with those seeds because we had them. We know what they liked. We know what was culturally preferable. We had the ability to reproduce them and get in there, but we didn't have permission and we didn't have funding to do that. And so we did it anyway, but it was with contingency funding and we didn't talk about it. There are all kinds of resources out there that we haven't been able to tap into because we have had too much compartmentalization. And so my question is, how do we do the brainstorming? How do we have these conversations to talk to each other? Soji, it isn't that we didn't want to. We weren't allowed to. So how do we get this kind of planning and brainstorming out of the box restructuring? And AID, all the donors have a lot of levers. A lot of what we couldn't do was because we didn't have the funding to do it and the structures to do it. So how do we get that kind of brainstorming going to tap into all of the resources that are out there and want to be working together?
Thank you. Others from BIFAD? Lisa? Okay. Other questions? Yes, please.
So, Jim Ash, thank you to the panel. That was fantastic. Just a couple of comments. Emmy touched on what is sometimes, I think, the third rail of this discussion, which just briefly touched on population. And so, Emmy, if you could just maybe 3 more words on your view and how population and education about population can be helpful. And then secondly, Colin, your comments indicated to me that there is a lack of understanding of the mutuality of welfare between groups that I think to us seem as if they should get that immediately. Herders and farmers, urban and rural populations. And it seems to be, as in all conflict, obviously it's an us versus them situation, but in some of these cases it seems as though there's a missing educational piece or a missing
political piece or a missing social piece to get to the recognition of the mutuality of benefit?
These are great questions. I think let's take two from the audience and then turn it back to the panel. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Alan Kozlow with Team Rubicon, which actually goes in and aids in international natural disasters. And first, I just want to say that international natural disasters might be a good laboratory for looking at how to handle hostile, post-hostile situations, because you have a much more controlled situation. And secondly, everybody made the assumption that food insecurity leads to conflict. My question is, has this actually been looked at academically and compared non-food insecurity situations that have not led to conflict with food insecurity situations that have led to conflict? Thank you. Great panel, by the way.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, Dave.
Is the mic on? We've heard about the disruption from conflict, about the importance of resilience, the importance of moving from food aid to agricultural development, the importance of social contracts, all very important things. My question is, what is the role of capacity building to create the kind of deeply rooted foundations that indeed do lead to resilience, do lead to long-lasting change, especially institutional capacity building, as well as human, but especially institutional. And how does that relate to the existing and past efforts of capacity building? Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I'll quickly turn back to the panel. Emmy, do you want to go first?
Since I obviously touch the third rail of reproductive health, right? One of the areas in the violence literature is violence against women. Another area in the health literature is a huge unmet demand for contraception. And I think these things are coming to a head in West Africa, where fertility rates are high, like between 6 and 7 per woman. And these fertility rates are actually affecting the carrying capacity of communities to actually sort of advance. So I think that this is one of the areas that if I were sitting in USAID right now, I would make a specific point of conversation with the health group, because I think it really is important to empower women to feel as though they have control over their lives, and to ensure that the healthcare services that they're being provided, even either in a conflict situation or in normal spaces, are actually meeting their needs, which I think is pretty much the evidence points to the fact that they're not. So that's on that one. I wanted to make one other point on food security causing conflict, because I know we've all communicated slightly different perspectives on this. And I think Soji was right that sort of around 2010, Cullen knows this better than I, 2009, 2010, there was like this great outburst of research on food security and conflict. And it was, I did a paper for the Wilson Center at that point in USAID that concluded that conflict always causes food insecurity. There is no case in which there is conflict in which there is not food insecurity. But food insecurity in itself does not always cause conflict. There are lots of people who are food insecure, and I think you gave the numbers, Matt. A lot of people who are food insecure, 800 million, but only 130 million, are acutely food insecure, and even a lesser number of them are actually likely to engage in conflict. So exacerbate, contribute to, trigger, all of these words, I think, are the way to think about how food security relates to conflict. But Cullen is actually the expert, so let me.
Thanks, Emmy, yes.
It's always auspicious when somebody identifies you as the expert. So I'll pick up right where you left off, and I'll respond to some of the other comments briefly. I think this point about when and where food insecurity leads to conflict is an important one, because obviously it's important to understand the social, political, and economic context in which conflict is occurring more broadly, so that in general, food insecurity as a driver of conflict is more likely to be a significant contributor in contexts that are characterized by a high degree of social polarization, in parts of countries where there's relatively weak state presence, and importantly, where interactions between either, say, herding groups and farming groups, or interactions between rural dwellers and urban dwellers are politicized to the point where they're sort of very clear kind of favorites being played. And you can look, and I can point you to some evidence on this, looks at this specifically within the East African community that kind of draws out some of these implications for why you have relatively large levels of violence around these kinds of issues in parts of Kenya, but you don't have similar types of violent interactions in Tanzania, for example. Moving back to this earlier question about education, about the mutuality of benefit, I think that is something that's well understood in a more developed country context. I mean, it's something we certainly understand in the United States as we've become wealthy enough to both subsidize consumption for those who need it in terms of targeted kind of benefits, but also subsidize production in a variety of ways. They're obviously important for the Iowan economy, but are more generally important for the United States to meet not just its own food security needs, but also to be a net contributor to meeting the food security needs of other countries. And so I think that there is potential for education here, but we are going to have to, as a political scientist, I think it's incumbent on me to mention the fact that we are going to have to acknowledge the fact that in some of these contexts, these things are at least being framed as zero-sum kinds of issues. And so there may be a better narrative that is out there, but I think that zero-sum narrative is often a very powerful and attractive one. And I also just wanted to mention, in terms of this issue of reducing compartmentalization and encouraging participation with the policy process, I think on the one hand, there's definitely a generational shift, and there's also been a shift in the major funding agencies in terms of encouraging scientists at every point in their career to be much more aware of their broader impacts. And so I think that there is a little bit more of a carrot than there had been in the past to engage. This is especially important for those communities like mine, political science or sociology, who have historically studied politics but not necessarily wanted to get involved in them, especially in the more international kind of context. And then also, since we have university president here, this is also about the incentive structure within the academy, so that if you make this type of engaged research, especially the type that engages with policy processes and does not provide obvious opportunities for credit claiming and grandstanding and byline pieces in major newspapers, et cetera, you will get more of this kind of engagement. So making sure that we get that incentive structure right in our home institutions is vitally important. Thank you.
I'm not sure that I have very much to add given the questions, but maybe I'll talk one thing on the causal aspects. I think causality is incredibly dangerous in a lot of these complex ecosystems around the world. And so trying to find what is the causal factor between food insecurity and conflict, or any number of reasons and conflict, has bedeviled scholars and policymakers for a long time, related to a lot of different violent conflicts. And I think that we probably owe it to ourselves in policymaking and academic circles to come up with better paradigms of how to explore the interaction of many factors and many actors in the same place in dynamic situations over time, so we're not constantly demanding small causal pieces of information that then we make very large decisions with information that was measured over a small static moment in time. This is probably antithetical to many who have looked for the most crisp statistics that we can possibly get about that causality, but I think we can move to much more complexity aware, and we can borrow from math and science and physics, who have been working with complexity science for quite some time and trying to look at many factors and many interactors. And we are in an age of computing that can allow us to see those interactions happen in real time through computational modeling and the like. The second point on that is I think that there is an incumbency of research literacy within policymaking communities, and I say this as spending 10 years at the State Department and including at the White House and the National Security Council, is that there are moments in which all you want is that one statistic that is going to prove why your policy intervention is going to make the most impact over time. And I think that research literacy, being able to understand the different methodologies, the difference between mixed methods, qualitative, quantitative, and the like, is really helpful for policymakers in making those large-scale decisions. So what Colin said about that engagement with the academy earlier and over time, I think is incredibly important. And the last question on institutional capacity building, I think that it's not only very critical in trying to how do we think about prevention over the long term, but it also gives a lot of agency back to communities into defining their own future. And so when you think about capacity building as equipping them with the skills and the trades that they're able to design a future that is unknown to their current status quo, it's a very provocative and positive inducing framework. And so capacity building, not just for the skills that we think that they need today, but what are the capacity building that you can be doing in a much more open-ended world.
Thanks. Soji, last very brief word.
Okay, let me just comment on the capacity building question. Oftentimes in crisis zones, one of the most significant casualties of the conflict is capacity itself. You know, in northeast Nigeria, local government took off. They were almost to Abuja. Hospitals were bombed. Boko Haram took medical equipment back into Zambisa forest, and schools were closed. And so when we think about capacity building, we need to really think seriously about where do you start. And in Nigeria, in my work, we developed the concept of building back better, meaning that sometimes the previously existing capacity may well be the cause or part of the causes of the challenge that you're facing in the first place. So maybe we need to be thinking about building new forms of capacity. So it's one point that I do want to make, that we need to think about new ways of thinking about how to build capacity. Capacity for whom? Capacity by who leads the charge, because oftentimes you're building back from basics because much has been destroyed. And oftentimes also, I think that at the national level, even national policymakers often have no sense of what, most of them never saw the crisis coming. So trying to talk to them about capacity building is, you know, they just didn't get a sense that their relationships that might have led to the crisis in the first place. So you do have to convince them about capacity building before you can actually go in and help build capacity. This is just from my own observation from being on the ground, yes.
Thanks, Soji. Well, I have failed miserably as a moderator at keeping my panel in time, but please help me thank the panelists, because I think we've had a very exciting discussion.
Dr. Howard, I want to say thank you, and to the distinguished panelists for this excellent presentation this morning. You have absolutely set the stage and given us great insight onto this very important issue. I thank you. I would also like to recognize one of our BIFAD board members who's joined us this morning, Mr. Richard Lackey, who's here with us. Richard, please stand. He is the CEO and chairman of the World Food Bank, and he's able to be with us this morning. Richard, we're glad you're here. We're going to take a quick break now. Our plans are to reconvene here at precisely 10:45. So see you back in just a few moments.
Yes.
Go from one side to the next, you can just
Oh, you can
down,
push
right?
the arrow, or we have the pointer. It also has a laser if you need to make it easy. Whatever you prefer.
Thank you.